This screencast has to do with the absolute basic unit of the nervous system, and that is the neuron. There are literally over 100 billion neurons in the human brain. So typically we think of it as a microscopic unit. Here is a picture, kind of a blown up picture of the neuron. The basic parts of the neuron that you need to know. We talk about the dendrites, the axon, and then the terminal branches of the axon. And we'll talk about something in particular there in just a minute, along with the cell body. Um, Basically, if you remember for the neuron, the dendrites of the neuron receive messages from other neurons. Okay, so dendrites receive messages, the axon sends messages. So if you can kind of remember those two things, dendrite receives, axon sends. That's a key component of the neuron. The other thing to note is that when a neuron does send a message, and we'll talk about this many times in class as well, but when the neuron sends a message, it gets a chemical message that the dendrites pick up, and the dendrites then receive that chemical message, and then they send an electrical message throughout the body of the neuron. So as the message travels down and along the axon to the other end of the neuron, it is an electrical message. But then when this neuron decides to send its message, okay, basically it sends a chemical message that goes out in from the terminal branches of the axons. Or in other words, you can see kind of little, I don't know if you can see the mouse here, the cursor, but from the little bulbs at the end, they're actually little, they call them terminal boutons. Looks like the word button, but it's bouton. It's terminal bulbs or terminal boutons. And those things emit a chemical into the environment, which, we're going to talk about it being a synapse. The little gap that is between neurons is referred to as a synapse. And basically, these terminal bulbs would release a chemical known as a neurotransmitter into the little synaptic gap between it and the next neuron. And then the next neuron decides whether or not there's enough of that neurotransmitter to cause it to send the next message. So let's just kind of sum up what we see on this page, okay? Dendrites receive a message. Axon sends messages. Now, you'll also notice that along the axon, there are little, like, it looks like little hot dog fatty tissue things that surround the axon. And those are referred to as the myelin sheath. Okay, it's a little protection for the axon. Not all neurons are myelinated. So in other words, not all of them have that little sheath to it, but many do. And that serves for two functions. Basically, it provides a little bit of protection for the axon, but it also allows messages, instead of having to travel the entire distance of the axon, the message, the electrical message, can literally skip from one end of the hot dog to the next end of the hot dog, and then from that next hot dog basically to end of the next hot dog. Basically, it allows the electrical message to skip. Okay, it's kind of hop skipping its way down the axon. And that's an important thing for, basically speeding up the message, okay? Because these axons, in some neurons in the body, we're talking about microscopic neurons that may just be, not even able to see without a microscope and so forth. But in some parts of the body, you may have axons extending from a particular neuron that may go several feet in distance. So it can make a difference in terms of the speed at which the messages are being sent. Now, let's talk about how the brain formed. And basically, about 2 weeks after conception, the brain consists of what we'd call random neurons. They're not specialized yet, not at that point. The brain the body basically just tends to produce a ton of neurons. And then through that huge amount of neurons, after about 2 weeks, those neurons begin to kind of migrate toward their proper locations. And they start developing axons, which, extend to whatever target that they're going to. So, for example, some neurons go to certain areas of the brain, other neurons go to other areas of the brain, some neurons may go to other areas of the body. It just depends, but they basically follow like a chemical pathway. It's almost like a little chemical river that causes these neurons to kind of go and the axons basically to go to their correct targets. So kind of interesting in that regard. Now at first, like I said, the nervous system creates way more neurons than it needs, basically to supply the system and to get things going. But then after a time period, it eliminates those that don't really do much. So again, it's one of those things where if the neuron ends up not being needed or not being used, then the body kind of eliminates it. Okay, and that brings us back to what we talked about in another screencast, and that is the idea of neural networks. Your experiences as you grow create changes in the brain, in your brain, and the anatomy of the brain. And so, literally, you can essentially make use of a lot of neurons and cause those neural networks to begin, or if you do not have a whole lot of experiences and things of that nature, then those neurons can essentially go to waste. Okay, and the other thing to note here on this slide is that neurons do migrate at different speeds. So I don't know if you know this or not, but there are certain parts of the brain, for example, the prefrontal cortex, that are not fully formed until you're around 24 years of age. So literally, we think of the brain and the body developing at a pretty good speed, but in reality, it can take many, many years for all of this to become complete. Couple different types of neurons. One is what we call an afferent neuron. The other is an efferent neuron. Afferent, the one that starts with an A, okay, those are basically sensory neurons. Think of it this way, that your 5 basic senses bring information in to the body, okay, in so that you can basically do something with it. So remember that afferent starts with an A, as in admission. So we're going to admit info into the body. Efferent neurons we're thinking of as motor neurons. Basically, they carry information out. So efferent starts with an E, as in exit. So for example, if if you're thinking about something, or when you go to move your arm or your hand or your fingers or your legs, you're moving those things. It's taking effort. It's taking information traveling down to your arms or to your hands or to your legs that tell your legs and tell your arms what to do. And that message is being sent by efferent neurons. Okay? Now, in terms of how a neuron fires, that's what we were talking about a little bit a second ago. You have, billions of these neurons together. And essentially, if a neuron is not active, if it's at rest, we call it a resting potential. It has a slightly negative electrical charge. If there is a message being sent, well then, let's say that the chemical in the brain starts to change. If the neurotransmitter if a chemical in the brain reaches a certain point, we call that a threshold. Okay, and when a neuron is stimulated to the point where it gets to a certain threshold, then it determines or it decides to fire. We say when a neuron is sending a message, we say it's firing. So when there's enough chemical or enough neurotransmitters around the dendrites that it stimulates that neuron, it reaches a threshold, and then that neuron fires, and it fires its message. And that's what we say that the neuron has gone into action potential. So, in other words, when it's not firing, we refer to it as resting potential. When it is firing, we talk about it being action potential. And there's a little bit of a different electrical charge to that. Now, when we talk about neurons firing, we have to talk about what's called the all or none principle. And what that means is a neuron either fires or it doesn't fire. It's kind of like a gun. If you go to fire a gun, you can pull the trigger maybe just a fraction of the way back and it doesn't fire. You pull it a little further back, it still doesn't fire. You pull the trigger a little further back, it still doesn't fire. It's not reached the threshold yet. But eventually, when you hit that threshold, when that trigger is pulled to a certain point and it hits the threshold, that gun fires. And it fires totally, it fires 100%. And that's exactly like a neuron does. It gets to a certain point and then it either fires or it doesn't fire. And when it does fire, there is a transfer of electrical ions across the axon's membrane. And basically it changes the electrical composition of the neuron. Okay? We will stop at that point.